Last of Us. The beloved post-apocalyptic story written by Neil Druckmann, developed by Naughty Dog and published by Sony Computer Entertainment back in 2013. We received a remaster a couple of years later on the PS4, and now on the 2nd of September 2022, we have the remake, titled The Last of Us Part 1. After playing through the game for only my second time since 2016 on the PS4, I want to hit you with a straight up point. If you've never played The Last of Us and own a PlayStation 5, don't buy it yet. First, I'd just like for you to take a few minutes to hear me out. There's no game I can quite compare it to if you've never played it or watched some walkthroughs. It's a mash of action, adventure, with a phenomenal tale of loyalty, loss, ghosts of years past, surviving and enduring. As the game's slogan so tells, endure and survive in a journey across post-apocalyptic America. The music composition is synergetic to the atmosphere. The voice acting is witty, sharp, and at times emotional, helping drive the story home. It's a story worthy of multiple 10 out of 10s, a sequel, and a HBO TV show in 2023. I enjoyed replaying the experience because it was so far gone from my mind. When I first experienced it in 2016, it felt fresh because whilst I ultimately knew what happens at the end, I didn't recall too many pivotal moments of the journey in the between of the start to finish. The cinematic story will take you anywhere from 12 to 14 hours depending on your difficulty, familiarity with the game and exploration intensity to find all the trinkets, collectibles, and that can take you even longer.
Empty. Maybe I can find some.
I'm simply summarising my thoughts of this game in 2022 for the time being as is. I will mention and address all my issues momentarily as a passenger on my second time around, like I'd expect most of you to be. But putting myself in a first time player's pair of shoes and going into this like a brand new game and story, I would be impressed. And don't let the horror aspect of it put you off. I know some people love games but don't want the stress and nightmares that come from horror genre. It's okay. There are people out there that instantly dismiss horror games until they try them. And I was like that until I played Resident Evil 7, then got hooked on the franchise. The horror is mostly in the atmosphere and tension of the level design. Once the creature backstory becomes clearer, the supernatural aura of dread around them withers away, and you discover the game is lacking any significant gotcha moments and scares, and is one of the few zombie games where you can effectively dispatch enemy types with melee combat. With the exception of a few spooky high-tension moments, you're almost always teamed up with an ally in the great outdoors, and it's the humans who can be the real malevolent menaces.
Bitch, I will bash your skull.
The combat is crunchy with the haptic sense. You feel the weight of the trigger pull with varied weapons, and you see the damage dealt. You can implement a cautious, stealth-based style for added tension on the higher difficulties with minimal ammo resources. As a first-timer, you'll experience the game of a generation, likely to be played again at some point in the future. But now I want to shift my stance on the game for those of us going in for a second, third, or even a fifth time around, and why in the present it is not worth the price of admission. What made The Last of Us great wasn't the haptics, the accessibility options, a timer in the top right of our screens, new outfits, or a mechanic that deletes our file upon death. These features were so niche, targeting such a small percentage of people, it came across as scraping the bottom of the barrel when it became the talking points by the developers after the game was announced in features and gameplay trailers. Most people already have monitors or recording devices, even average video editing software. It can display a timer for a speedrun, and permadeath is just a hip way of playing the game without a checkpoint. But when we take stats into account, we've only got about 43 million blind people who are legally blind. 2 to 3% of the planet at the highest estimates. And the fact that, in contrast, only 22 million PS5s have been sold to date. How many have access to a PlayStation 5 is the question, let alone this game, then sit down and have it narrated to them. It's targeted at such a minuscule audience, I'd be surprised anyone utilized this feature of narration in the accessibility options for anything except a gag. Though, according to Naughty Dog, this was a selling point. The devs used fancy punchlines like rebuilt from the ground up, visual overhaul, improved fidelity, and the PlayStation 5 was an open box of tools and goodies that will, quote, help us to reimagine, end quote, The Last of Us. Yeah, the characters were detailed and they were visually overhauled with improved fidelity, but how many people are actually looking to fall into the characters' eyes, having experienced their journey and fates before? To be constantly kept in this world, as put by the creative director and writer. I think it begs the question of what is a writer and director's role in a game where the story hasn't even been partially rewritten or touched up? The opportunities to rebuild were there. It was like hearing a bunch of flirtatious words over Tinder. Talk the talk, but short on walking the walk. Inflating the customer's expectations for more, but ultimately receiving nothing new that will form to be memorable. After I played The Last of Us in 2016, going into this in 2022, I don't remember the game for its nuances, frowns, shimmer in the character's eye, or the way the bottles in the environment smashed on the ground. The feeling is fleeting, and you ultimately remember the experience for its much more direct engagements with the player, like character movement, gunplay, stealth, takedown animations, and your ability to interact with the environment. Everything that made The Last of Us in 2016 on the PS4 memorable, well, it's still here, and nothing more was given that the player takes away, making the experience feel rebuilt. Very few people will walk away with subtleties like the haptics of drawing a bow or pumping a shotgun as overly immersive moments that grip them closer to the story. Cyberpunk literally released a patch for this, not a whole new game. As years go by, all the BS of graphics fade from memory. I don't remember games like Grand Theft Auto San Andreas for its mind-blowing graphics, or more story-driven games on the PS3 gen like Metal Gear Solid 4 for its fidelity and character facial animations. I won't look back at The Last of Us Part 1 in newfound glory because my controller rumbles when it rains and you touch a giraffe. Or that characters look more human. I'm playing a game, and whilst I appreciate how far graphics have come, I'm not seeking a fictional story to become real life. Seeing chippables and breakables doesn't evoke fear in a story you know. It barely leaves a dent impression, especially when it's in a tight combative area. The game is pitched as if you're going to stroll through an art gallery and not run for your life when a bloater is hot on your heels. I will give props to the enemy AI. It's hard to reflect back 6 years to their sophistication levels then, but it seems like they do a far better job at flanking, tracking you, and ambushing you. I had some really intense gun battles, and the human enemies did feel like they were coordinating their attacks to rush and flank a lot more effectively. But then creature enemies all identically react to a bottle plopping in the water, even though they're blind. Somehow clickers locate you when you're in front of them, even if you're not moving. Which brings me to the point of why not add more in? I'm not talking new characters or new character models, but new spawn locations of enemies, more enemy density or surprise attacks. That's the stuff that will become memorable to players and make for fresh experiences. Something new jumps out, something memorable. You're in a quick time event that wasn't there before, you're mashing square, something that you'll take away at the end of the playthrough when you least expect it. And don't give me that we're keeping true to the story speech. There was a simple mechanic before I started the game asking me if I wanted to apply a pre-order bonus to the game. Give the same type of option if you want to play the game in its original format, or say a director's cut, which will still keep the same world and engagements but add potentially new encounters by slightly altering enemy behavior. further or throw in more of them. Players would get something fresh that truly feels different and memorable. A whole new challenge for speedrunners and grounded players. Ultimately, the development claim they improved the AI for the buddies, but in the heat of battle, they are totally insignificant. You don't spend more than a moment worried about their position in the environment unless they run into trouble. Don't get me even started on model viewer, clothing unlockables that you only get at the end of the playthrough, and motion matching that was supposed to be a big deal and makes for smooth, more lifelike character movements, I think they said. That was something I wouldn't even have known was there if they hadn't told me. Thanks, Neil. I think they pushed the frontier of accessibility and all the little nuances because they had barely anything to show for it. They did barely anything to get this game out there. You didn't have to scout locations, take photographs, design new structures, add or change characters, record new dialogue, or implement a single sentence of new writing and directing. The tension and the release of it isn't because of the reimagined environment. It's the same tension you would have felt in the exact same environment 8 years ago on a PS4. I guess some silver lining kudos to the new workbench animations, but even then that isn't entirely a new concept. I'd argue it was better in The Last of Us Part 2, as weapons could actually get dirty and grimy and would need to be cleaned. For someone who didn't play the remaster with headphones, I guess I could also give some brownie points for the 3D audio. It was a significant feature for me personally that added to the game in its tenser moments. However, I can't commend this as groundbreaking. 7.1 channel audio headsets have been around since the PS3 era. The Last of Us Part 1 is better than the remaster. And if you judge it on those merits alone, then Naughty Dog delivered. It's a 10 out of 10 game from 2013. But is it worth 125 Australian dollars? Like on the date of recording, as it still stands now on the Oz PlayStation Store? No. The developers glamorized a touched up finished product from almost a decade ago. They didn't revamp the combat. Whilst it was crunchy thanks to DualSense, the on-screen devastation was relatively neutered. A lot of headshot animations were just a guy with his jaw blown off. Using a shotgun on limbs doesn't dismember the enemies like players would have been used to seeing in Part 2. You might be thinking, don't like it, don't buy it, or why the hell did you pay for it? Well, it's a simple answer to the latter. Someone has to, so reviews like this can be made. Not everyone is in a position to get games sent to them early for review. We have to hold developers accountable, and the best way to do that is with your wallet by not funding something that's underdone and, frankly speaking, lazy. One of the developers defended the notion that this was not a cash grab, describing the game as the most meticulous project he has ever worked on, whilst people are literally commenting after that the launch animations are much more inconsistent compared to Part 2. When rebuilt from the ground up, animations were supposed to be king dick of all selling points for Part 1. And then he goes on to justify that the people involved had different levels of experience. In other words, inexperienced developers, and that it was a good thing, concluding that Part 2 had a much longer development cycle. I don't know about you, but Part 2 didn't cost 125 Australian dollars.
Fuck! God damn it.
And you're basically admitting the game was done as a stepping stone for new devs on the block to gain experience. You're Naughty Dog. There should be a certain reputation to uphold. You wouldn't go out and buy a Rolls Royce and see the manufacturer publicly claiming, hey, we had some noobs working on our 2022 model so they can gain experience, learn and grow, bruh. Lazy. Lazy because if you're experienced, the senior developer, you should go over the game with a fine tooth comb and rectify issues, especially on a full price third release. And by stating the shorter development window, you're basically rephrasing this is a cash grab, because the asking price isn't reflective of the amount of man hours and resources invested in development. I bought and played this game to distance myself from speculation. It gives me the right as a paying customer to rate the game freely and share my thoughts as a full-fledged participant. I bought it because I wanted to develop my video game skills, walkthrough commentary, and editing. I didn't just roast the game as soon as it booted up to enjoy and experience the remake with my best foot forward, not a negative connotation at the forefront of my mind. The visuals are good, the gameplay is satisfying, and the story is brilliant. All those things on its own merits make a great game. But the fact remains that it did not reinvent the wheel. And considerations like the fact it's a third release of the same story, that no new features already seen in the franchise in Part 2 were carried over except for the workbench. Culminated with the heavy price, I conclude this is the biggest cash grab that Sony and Naughty Dog have pulled since their inception. They did this purely to line their own pockets by investing the least amount of resources while enabling their junior developers to practice and gain experience straight out of the consumer's pocket. This review wouldn't even exist if the game was fairly priced at around 70 Australian dollars or around 49 American dollars. I think games like this with full price tags are exactly what the industry does not need more of. And I would hate to see this become the start of a trend from other beloved game franchises.